All right, now we are live again after some technical difficulties. So, Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome to the channel, The Muslim Suicide Researcher. And I'm doing something new this time around. I had previously done some educational videos, and I thought that it might be worthwhile to try and engage now directly on the ground with people who are part of the Muslim community and who represent voices that are extremely critical to be represented in the conversations around suicide prevention. So we are currently in Suicide Awareness Week. And this is a very interesting Suicide Awareness Week for Muslim Americans in particular, because 9/11 happens to land on the end of it. So that's an interesting juxtaposition, which we can talk about a little bit if there's some interest. But let me introduce myself. So I'm doing a PhD at Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, and I was recently funded by the National Institutes of Health to conduct research investigating the risk and resilience factors of suicidality for Muslim Americans, particularly South Asians of second generation immigrant origin. So as a researcher, but also as a survivor of a suicide attempt, this is extremely important issue to me. I'm very passionate about it. And I'm very lucky and blessed to have the mentorship and friendship and sisterhood with Sister Lobna Mulla right here. And Sister Lobna Mulla is the chaplain at the Institute of Knowledge at UCLA. She's the Muslim chaplain, and she's also a member of the board of directors at Yaqeen Institute for Islamic Research. So welcome, ahlan wa sahlan.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum. Nice to be here with you, Amelia. Thank you for inviting me.
Of course. So let's also talk about the format of everything. So the way that this is going to go is we're going to kind of flip things around. I'm not the one who's going to be interviewing Lubna. She's actually going to be kind of doing a casual chat, Q&A. The point of this is to not have like a very structured conversation. I've actually not even seen the questions that she's going to ask me. So it's going to be an exciting adventure. And, you know, the goal is really for us to try and address some of the gaps in our knowledge. You know, as someone who's in the scientific field, it's difficult for me to know everything on the ground, like what people are struggling with. And I think Sister Lubna has a really direct exposure to what people are talking about. So she's going to be able to try and cover some of the gaps of knowledge that come from research that I'm going to try and cover. So inshallah, let's take it away.
Yes, great. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. You know, one of the main tenets of Islamic law, one of the main fundamental goals of Islamic law is preservation of life. So I don't see a more befitting talk here than suicide prevention, which really is, you know, trying to really preserve that sanctity of life. And of course, it's not just the life itself, it's the mental health and the well-being of that individual as well. So, you know, what an exciting opportunity I have to talk to Amelia today. I'm really excited. Jazakallah khair for inviting me once again, alhamdulillah. So I wanted to ask you, you know, what inspired you to go into this field? This is such a stigmatized topic in general, and particularly in the Muslim community. It's something that we don't feel comfortable talking about. So what inspired you to go into this work?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked me that, especially as the first question, because I think that's really important. I think my personal story is really central to kind of unpacking why this issue matters, as you know, for people in general, but particularly for me. You know, I actually came into public health. I was doing my Master of Public Health at Columbia, and I had entered as a maternal mental health major with the intention to pursue humanitarian crisis. So, you know, I was going to travel around the world and tell people what they're doing wrong about understanding maternal mental health. And subhanAllah, it was 2015. At that time, there was a lot of, you know, rise in Islamophobic violence. And I thought, you know, with so many events happening politically that keep bringing this up as like first wave, second wave, third wave of Islamophobia, I thought I can't be the only Muslim out here who's like constantly feeling depressed or anxious for being visible. You know, at the time I had worn hijab, and I, you know, it was for me a very clear marker when the San Bernardino shooting happened, like, okay, we need to have a voice. We need to have research on, you know, how much we're affected by discrimination, because I know for a fact that I experienced this and I feel, you know, a certain level of internalized Islamophobia, like, oh, I don't want to be Muslim. I don't want to be known as Muslim. And, you know, the struggle with hijab, you know, all of that kind of came into play, and I decided to do an original research study approved by the IRB at Columbia, the ethics board, and conducted a research on being a visible Muslim and how those kind of markers of visible identity, like Islamic garb, depending on, you know, what gender you are, can expose you to certain types of discrimination and perhaps also be connected to psychological distress. And so I found that there were strong correlations with hypervigilance, which is the notion of, you know, constantly being on alert, like, oh my God, is someone going to hurt me? Is something going to happen to me? And so that, you know, translated eventually to me going into Hopkins. I had no intentions of pursuing a PhD. I mean, let's not even talk about how many thousands of dollars of debt I have in student loans. So if there's anyone who wants to question my intentions in doing this research, they are welcome to pay my student loans, because
Nobody
there's a
can
lot.
question. Nobody can question it, alhamdulillah. Such important work that you're doing, mashallah.
Thank you. Alhamdulillah. And then, you know, I mentioned, I'm a survivor of an attempt, and I think that it's critical for me to be out there as and in the open, sort of out of the closet, so to speak, as a survivor, because there's such a deep stigma around suicide, and just kind of being someone who has survived it. I shouldn't be ashamed of that. I should be proud of that. I should be proud of the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave me this beautiful life, this precious life. And guess what? I got to see the birth of two children of my own, you know? So this is amazing. Like, life is not always going to be this really, really dark place. And so I'm very passionate about extending that message, extending the mercy and the Islamic principles of life preservation to Muslims all across the world.
Alhamdulillah. I really appreciate your being so vulnerable in sharing that with people, because I think people who are struggling with life in general need to hear that, you know, behind every success story, it's not all, you know, this lovely path scattered with rose petals, that there are difficulties, even you know, really facing some very dark moments and some very scary moments. And I'm very happy, alhamdulillah, that you survived that. And I hope that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you know, continues um, to you know, bring that positive energy in your life and help you to overcome those obstacles. And I really appreciate, again, your sharing, because people need to see that it's okay to talk about you know, having that suicide ideation, you know, attempting and then overcoming it, and that is a success, that is a victory. So I really do appreciate you mentioning that. What are, you know, for people that might not be aware, what are contributing factors that may that you're finding in your research that, you know, that contributes to people having suicide ideation or attempts?
Absolutely. And you know, that's always the number one question I get, no matter where I go, who's asking. That's the number one question I get. And unfortunately, the response I have to say is we don't know. And that's the problem, because, you know, research on suicide is very still kind of in this zone of like we don't know like a full package or full picture of what contributes to suicide risk across populations, let alone specific groups like Muslims or racial minorities, right? We have certain risk factors that contribute across the board. So, for example, like having a previous mental illness, you know, if you have access to lethal means, if you know someone who's been close to you, like a close person or a loved one who attempted or died by suicide, those are all factors that kind of, regardless of who you are going to play into some level of risk. However, when it comes to particular communities, especially the Muslim American community, right? Um, we don't really know what is going to actually contribute to suicide risk. And that's where my research comes into play. Alhamdulillah, I don't know if I mentioned this in the intro, but I got NIH funding from the National Institute of Health to actually try and attack this issue, right? Like, this is the first time the federal government has recognized us and recognized the worthiness of our population and just how much insights from our particular lived experiences with discrimination of all kinds, right? Not just Islamophobia, but racism, nativism, of being immigrant origin. I mean, not all Muslims are of immigrant origin, but 79% are first or second generation. And, you know, our very intersectional experiences with oppression are what place us at a very unique strength and standpoint for other groups to benefit from the insights that we have, right? So when I find out, and that's what's special about my research, if I might toot my own horn.
Please do, because we need to know.
Oh my God, I'm doing this video.
Exactly.
um, you know, the whole point of the research I'm doing is not to just kind of come into the community and say, hey, pass this survey link and, you know, let's just get a whole bunch of people to respond to it. No, 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 that's not the point. The point is, let's get on the ground. Let's talk to people who are deeply affected by this, who care to share their insights, whether they are personally affected or not. It's important to capture their perception of what contributes to suicide, because the perception plays a lot into the behavior. And so, you know, we need to understand what people think are the factors of suicide in the Muslim community, because if we don't hear it from them themselves, then we can't, you know, actually establish the instruments like the surveys to collect the proper questions and the proper answers. Now, if we're asking the wrong questions, we're going to get the wrong answers. So the point of my research is to really go into the community, do workshop, and say, okay, you tell me, and I'm going to map it out with fancy statistical software and literally make a map of, you know, your responses. And you're going to tell me, do those responses, you know, are they important? Are they significant? What matters about them? I want to ask you, give me your voice, because your voice is the one that's ultimately going to end suicide. I'm just here with the tools, the resources, and use me to try and tackle this issue. So I consider myself kind of a conduit of sorts.
Amazing. Amazing. And what do you hope to accomplish or promote in your, you know, with your findings and with the ongoing work that you're doing?
Inshallah, inshallah. I mean, my dua is that this ummah is never afflicted with deaths that are self-directed. Uh,
Ameen. Ameen.
I mean, that is the ultimate goal. That is the ultimate vision. If in my lifetime I've even played a minor role in preserving even just one person's life, I have done my job. And you know, there's the hadith about that. Saving the life of one person is like saving the life of the entire ummah.
Yes,
So,
absolutely.
you know what I mean? And you know, for me, suicide, not just because it's a personal issue, but if you think about it, really just think about it, right? What other disease is there that we bring on to ourselves? What other issue is there that we kill ourselves? That's what suicide is. Like, think about how that doesn't even make sense. Like, in the natural world, it's rare to find this in animalistic behavior,
Oh,
right?
wow.
This is not something that is natural to human existence. So if suicide is happening, and we know it's happening because we have research data that shows that Muslim Americans are twice as likely to report having a suicide attempt in their life compared to other faith groups. So if we know that there's research on this now just emerging, and that research came out of Dr. Rania Awad's lab, the Muslim Mental Health and Islamic Psychology lab at Stanford University, you know, that came out just like less than 8 weeks ago, right? Now we're just trying to begin the conversation. And in many ways, it might be too late if we don't act now. And this is not something that's my particular issue. This is an issue that requires a collective
Oh,
effort.
absolutely.
How, like, you know, breaking a stigma, that's not just something that I'm just gonna, you know, go on social media and make viral posts. No, this is really like something that the community really needs to invest in from an ideological standpoint, from a financial standpoint, from an advocacy standpoint. I mean, from a very global, holistic perspective, we need full-fledged effort on this. And I really don't want to have to be the only person kind of standing and doing this.
Yes, no, absolutely. And I can see how your efforts, along with the efforts of others, is going to raise that awareness, is going to, bring upon the understanding, honestly, to destigmatize this issue so that we can be more comfortable in addressing this issue in this subject matter. How my thought was, how do you see different aspects of the community working together to help? So how does this look like on the ground? You're bringing the awareness, you bring the statistics, people are woken up. They're contributing, to causes that will support. What are the different types of causes that will help? There's the masjid, there's different, mental health organizations. How do you see this playing out? Obviously, that's kind of like the key to, really ending this disease. But how do you see some of that playing out?
Absolutely. Bismillah. So, there's
Or what
there's
you would like to see, how you think, or what you would like to see on the ground.
several answers to that, to be honest. Let me start off with a little story. So last night, I had a little dinner date with a girls' night out with one of my sister friends in the community. And she's mashallah like a pretty well-known figure. She's someone who was part of establishing one of the first IB Islamic schools in the country. And she has a good sense of the pulse of what the community, where the community is at. And so I was essentially asking the question that you're asking me. And because I just don't know. I don't know myself unless someone tells me this is how the world operates. Because, I'm removed so much because I'm in academia. And I was telling her, like, here's my effort. Like, I want us to all, from all the masajid and all the like third spaces and every other like social org you can think of, like, let's gather people to show up to the suicide prevention walk. And, there's suicide prevention walks going on all over the country right now, throughout September and October. And they're run by the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. And I was like showing her this like glamorous strategy to get people on board. And then she's like, yeah, Amelia, but no one's gonna like care because how are you gonna already going to this walk are already invested. So you're not actually targeting the right audience. And I was like, oh my God, you're so right. You're so right. So then she was telling me how important it is to have education and have awareness. And I said, well, you know what? One of the issues that I faced is trying to get buy-in from the leaders at the masajid, from the board members, from just people who do even like leisure activity planning and programming, right? Just all people across the board who are working in different capacities in the Muslim community. This isn't like something that just passes on their radar all the time. And a huge problem is that most people are just unaware of just how deeply this affects people. And I said to my friend, I said, why doesn't this jar people? And she's like, it does jar people, but it's just that something like this happens in the community, people mourn, people grieve, and then they move on and they forget. And it's not like an issue that's kind of just like in front of them all the time, like it is in your world where like all you do is talk about death and suicide. And I was like, you're right. Like I am so absorbed in that world. So I do have a lot of blind spots in understanding what people's just daily life is like. So no one's really thinking, oh, is my kid gonna be suicidal? Like no one's thinking that, right? No one's, but that's the problem. People don't know that their kids could be suicidal. They don't even know what signs there could be for, being suicidal. And I was telling her that, unfortunately, because there is so much gatekeeping involved in, it's Muslim programming and just a lot of stuff, funding issues and conflicts of interest, whatever you may have. There's a lot of barriers to really getting this message out there, but the number one barrier truly is education, because even like the imams and the shuyukh and everything, like all the main, people who keep the web of the community together, they themselves may not actually understand how important this is because they themselves aren't educated or aware. And that's really the critical problem, because if they're going to be selective about which causes to support and which ones to really bring into the foray of the public, and the social kind of scene, right?
Yeah.
Like if we're talking like what khutbahs are you going to deliver? What topics are going to be at the khutbahs? What topics are going to be at the Saturday halaqas, right? Like if we're talking about this and we don't have a strategic plan in place because this is not even on our radar, then how are we even making the proper decisions to allocate funding, to allocate programming? I mean, if people aren't aware of the magnitude of the problem, or even that this is a problem, then how are they going to make the proper decisions to support something like this? So
Yeah.
I truly think my friend was right. It is a lot about education, and it's all hands on deck. Every person, from a person who doesn't even have, quote unquote, power, truly does have power. People who are unaffiliated with masajid, people who even supposedly have, quote unquote, left Islam. I think all of those people, as long as you relate to the Muslim experience in America, this applies to you.
Yes. Oh, thank you so much for that. And I think, at least in my local experience, I do feel that imams and shuyukh are definitely getting more aware with, understanding the risks of suicide. I think, sometimes they're getting hands-on exposure, unfortunately, whether it's ideation or an attempt, or people in the community dying by suicide. And perhaps there's a disconnect with the board sometimes, or perhaps, on a larger scale, now maybe out of my circle that I know personally, perhaps it's also, like you said, providing the tools. Well, how do we talk about suicide? And what do we talk about? Right. So I think, the issues that you brought up is really, really important. And like you said, I hope everybody can be an advocate. Like, we want to hear more about this. Okay. So, you brought up a really interesting point. How much do you think our lack, I'll share like, an experience, we had, unfortunately, I'm aware of someone in the community that had died by suicide. And I don't think, other than the close circle, people understood what had actually happened. And that's part of the stigma. Just
Mm.
like overdosing, you say someone died in their sleep, but it
Mm-hmm.
was, whether it was an intentional or unintentional, right? Not necessarily related to dying by suicide.
Mm.
But what if there is a known, you know, death caused by suicide? Do families talk about it? Do people even know that it happened, or we just say he died or she died? So, so there's a stigma around suicide. Even forget about talking about prevention, but even when it happens.
Mm.
So why do you think this exists?
Mm.
What could be some of the cultural, religious understandings that contribute to the stigma?
You know what's funny, Lubna? And that's also a really popular question that I get asked. And the interesting thing is that the response has truly not a lot to do with anything, any particular religion, any particular ethnic group or racial group. Truly, across the board,
Yes.
shame.
Wow.
Shame affects all of us, and many of us have deep rooted shame, and that comes from pride. And pride isn't the worst thing, right? I mean, pride has its place in preserving your life, for example, right? You should be proud to live your life. You should be proud that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave you the privilege of being in this dunya and seeing the beautiful earth, right? And having beautiful people around you. But pride taken to another level, and I know so much of Islamic scholarship focuses, for example, on the nafs and reforming the nafs, you know that has its place. And I think in general, though, from a social perspective,
Yes.
shame is such a huge concept. People do not want their self-image to be affected negatively by perceptions that other people have of them that may also be negative, right? People do not want to be seen in a bad light, in other words. People want to be understood as being worthy, as being, valuable, that they matter, that they exist, they're seen, they're heard for who they are. And they have a very particular image of who they want to be seen as. And oftentimes, and this is truly what is one of those unintended uh, consequences, which is actually kind of an unintended blessing of suicide work, is I truly think if people came out and said, yes, my child died by suicide, you know what that does? You know what that does, Livna? It levels the ground for all of us.
Yes.
Because if someone sees, yeah, you don't have to be like the perfect family. You don't have to, we're all dysfunctional families, okay? Like, let's just establish that. You know that childhood trauma is extremely common in the United States. Not to establish it as something that's normal or acceptable,
Sure.
but most of us are growing up in environments because of this very oppressive system, right? This capitalist, racist system. Most of us are exposed to a lot of trauma, and most of us don't have the coping mechanisms to deal with that trauma and process it and regulate our emotions. So, because we don't have those tools, it's not our fault. It truly isn't our fault that someone is suicidal. However, if someone dies by suicide, that is our fault. That is our collective responsibility. And we should absolutely, absolutely be ashamed of the fact that we allowed that to happen on our watch, because it is our collective responsibility to ensure that we are all promoting each other's social connectedness, which actually it happens to be the number one factor to buffer any sort of mental health issue, including suicide.
Yes. And you brought up, and I think we have a few minutes left here. I think you brought up a really important connection, that if I may offer that, you talked a lot about, the stigma of suicide and shame. And that was so poignant. I really appreciate you bringing that up. Oftentimes I feel it is a mental health issue, right? And I think part of the stigma of understanding suicide is like, well, also mental health, not being well mentally is also a stigma.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But this can happen, to somebody who's had a lifelong struggle with mental health, or somebody because of current strain of events.
Absolutely.
Can you talk about that? Why is that something we need to be ashamed of? We don't get ashamed when we break our arm.
We don't. You broke it doing something that you shouldn't have been doing.
Perhaps.
But in terms of the mental health stigma, I mean, first of all, you don't actually have to have a previous history of mental illness to die by suicide. That is a risk factor.
Right.
And for sure, it's a pretty major risk factor. However, there are people who attempt suicide for circumstances in their life.
Yes.
For example, in India, it's not, it's an unspoken truth that people don't want to admit, that so much family pressure during the college years drives students to suicidal death. And some of those expectations and norms continue on in this country, in the United States. But in terms of being ashamed of mental health, I mean, mental health is something that we've established for hundreds of years. There were hospitals that in Muslim majority countries that treated patients who had mental illnesses with like music therapy and all sorts of beautiful interventions. So this is not a conversation that's new at all. It's been existing for a really long time. And I think what people really need to understand about the shame around mental health is that it's not a reflection of who you are or a value. It's really truly a reflection of what environments you've been put in. So if you were put in an environment where you had loving parents who cared for you, who had a proper, secure attachment to you, who provided for you, or if not your parents, then a caregiver that you truly, truly, felt like a sense of support from. And you also had an environment in which where you went to school, you were able to thrive. You were able to get good grades because you were interested in the material. You could function because you had enough food in your belly. You weren't afflicted with poverty, right? Um, and then you go as an adult into an environment where you have a steady job, you have steady housing, you have a steady source of income, and you have social support. You have friends in your life who care about you. I mean, does that describe the average regular person to you, Lubna?
No,
No.
absolutely
Does that describe the average regular person to you in the Muslim community?
no.
No, no, no. So it's not your fault. It's not your fault. It's the fact that you've been put in these environments that were completely out of your control, right? You were born into this environment. You were born with certain privileges, and you were born with certain disadvantages, and those occur at a structural level, right? Like, Islamophobia is a structural force. It's something that occurs within the policies of this country, within the media of this country, right? That is something that is not, we're in control of. I was born in the United States. I was not in control of being born somewhere else. That's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decreed for me, right? So what it comes down to is how you're tying your camel. Are you seeking those environments which are going to allow you to flourish? Are you seeking the environments which are going to allow you to feel comfortable being who you are? Have you identified what a safe environment looks like? What a safe space looks like? Have you identified within yourself what potentially makes you feel unsafe? When you're talking to someone, when you're, out there in public, whatever it is, these are things that you need to start being mindful of on a daily basis, on a moment to moment basis, so that you can begin to kind of address the kind of situation you were given that was outside of your control. So you can reclaim control over your environment, and as you can kind of increase your coping mechanisms, hopefully good positive coping mechanisms, not coping mechanisms related to um, eating and binge eating, binge drinking, binge substance use. Those are going to be harmful to you in the long run. They're not going to solve your problems. You're just going to avoid your problems. But you can actually take control of your life by taking control of your environment as much as you can, and surround yourself by people who support you and love you and genuinely care for you.
Mashallah, that's a beautiful, I think, recipe, inshallah, for success. And it was interesting when you were mentioning, kind of difficult positions people have put in. Imagine if one major source of comfort, which is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and understanding his mercy and his compassion and how much he gives us, and even in the tests that we struggle through, that there is benefit from it, we see it long term later. Imagine if even that has been corrupted in your right, your understanding, like that, astaghfirullah, right, that some people have been taught just like halal and haram, and this is bad and it's going to send you to hellfire. So imagine if even that, because I'm sure there's many people that struggle in life in these different bad situations, but when they have this beautiful, you know, image of Islam, and also they see it implemented on the ground in front of them, not like this betrayal of Islam, I'm sure that can be a tool for them too. And unfortunately, sometimes that's not there as well. So
I think that's on point, like to the umpteenth degree. I could not agree with you more, because I was recently on Facebook in a popular group of Muslim women. There's like over 40,000 people in this.
oh wow.
uh, women of all kinds of backgrounds Islamically, right? All kinds of Muslims, Muslims in America, Muslims across the world. And one of the questions that was posted on this group was, why do you think, what's your reasons that you think that so many youth are straying from Islam? And, there was a lot of very interesting responses, and each one of them reflected that person's unique lived experience, right? And the observations that they've had within the community. And so I honor all of those perceptions and analyses. I honor all of those, because there is a grain of truth to what people are saying. And if you take those little grains and you make them into a mound, and you try to find the patterns, and you try to build up this whole data around what is it, you would have to really look broad. You would have to expand and look kind of 40,000 bird's eye view perspective from the top of the mountain. And the answer for me is, how is Islam being embodied in a way that makes people feel safe? makes people feel welcomed, makes people enticed to learn about the benefits of spirituality.
Yeah.
And you know what? I'll tell you, I'm in the scientific community where religion and spirituality are highly stigmatized, right? Being secular is a prized identity, prized value. And subhanAllah, like Allah save me from that happening to me several times, not just in my recent scientific endeavors, but even in my youth, right? Even though I grew up Islamic school, I grew up in the youth group, I grew up in the masjid being built, I grew up being on the board of the MSA at UCLA. I mean, I was the Muslim child, right? And even I didn't feel safe in the Muslim community. I didn't feel welcomed. I didn't feel accepted. I didn't feel like I belonged. And there is a very prescriptive approach to halal, haram. Everything is so dogmatic, and it truly takes away from the essence of Islam. And that's really what I really love about Islam, is that I actually, through my scientific endeavors, very circuitously wound up back to spirituality, believe it or not, right? Like I wound up back to it, and I thought to myself, what's the missing ingredient in mental health? Because I don't believe things like prayer is the cure or Quran is the cure. I believe that being trust community is the cure. And that's because in our faith, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who is the master planner, the master of the universe, the most intelligent, the most knowledgeable, right? The most merciful, everything. He's the one who told us to pray in congregation. In this deen, it is incentivized to pray in congregation because we're going to get more thawab, we're going to get more rewards to pray and to be in a community space and to accept each other and to love each other. Those are like foundational principles of Islam that somehow have gotten watered down and actually completely abandoned in the mainstream kind of narratives that we hear during the khutbahs and all that. And, I think people like me have experienced a lot of spiritual trauma in these spaces because those narratives aren't the ones that are promoted often, right? And I personally don't have anything against bringing those narratives. I just think that there's very strategic dosages of where and when to bring that in place, right? I think that, really when we bring Islam into the foray, especially of kids who are now being born in Generation Z, right? I mean, I'm a millennial, and then you have kids being born in Gen Z and afterward. What they're coming into is potentially being a second generation or third generation Muslim in America. By this point, they've probably already lost the language of their parents. By this point, they've probably already lost the culture, even the food, possibly the music, possibly the clothes. At this point, they have entered a world where acculturation isn't even a process anymore. It's just an expectation. At this point, they're in public school systems. The majority of us are in public school systems where we are expected to behave a certain way, act a certain way, and conform to a certain understanding of what American means. So when that idea of what Americanness is presented in their lives, and this is what they're seeing whenever they go out and they step out the door, this is what they're seeing. And then they're seeing, on the other hand, you go to the masjid and the world is so different. The world is so different. The way that women are treated, the way that children even are treated, the power dynamics. Those are the ingredients that the youth observe, and they know better. They know that they should be being treated better, and they know what being treated better looks like. And I truly think that because they know that, they know what safety looks like. And so they know that this is not an environment where I can feel safe. So how are they going to even explore Islam if they don't even feel safe going to the masajid? I mean, we have an epidemic right now of people not going to the masajid. The masjid represents spiritual trauma for so many people. And so now there's like a huge movement of getting into third spaces and just getting, detached from the notion of what the construct of a masjid is supposed to mean, So I get it. I really get it. I get it from a lived experience perspective. And I just advocate for us to create spaces where Muslims of all backgrounds can feel safe exploring Islam, no matter where they are in the process of developing their spirituality.
Yes, absolutely, Amin. And I know that those places do exist, and I ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guides all of those with the hopes and dreams of building, a good Muslim community. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guide them to the path that will allow them to do so, and not succumb to these. I think honestly, sometimes these practices are not intentioned,
Oh,
but they happen, and like you said, I mean, it ends up in people not feeling safe. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that we have these spaces that people feel comfortable and want to come and learn. As you mentioned, that's a big component to making people feel comfortable and good about themselves.
absolutely. And you know what? Muslims aren't the only ones seeking spirituality. I can tell
Yes.
you that. Muslims don't have a monopoly on spirituality. Spirituality exists in all traditions, from indigenous cultures to Buddhism to Hinduism to, every major faith tradition on this earth. The vast majority of people on earth are seeking some form of metaphysical connection.
Yes, absolutely. Because it's a human need. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as our creator, when we understand him and we understand the best way to live, it's such a gift. So everyone is searching for it. We have a gift that we know who Allah is, and the perfect deen that he has, or way of life that he has constructed for us. I hope that we don't be the ones to turn people away from finding that, this treasure of Islam, inshallah. Any last thoughts that you would like us to know about your research or about this topic?
Sure, sure. So I think what's important to know about my research is that, I try very hard to root it in social justice principles. I'm doing something completely untraditional and unheard of in the research world in several ways. I mean, one, I'm putting myself out there as a survivor. Just that alone is shattering so many conventions. And I've had so much negative feedback about me being out there like
Oh,
this. And
wow.
so, just that alone. But then I have other things, right? Like I'm on social media. I'm trying to get people involved from a social media perspective on the ground, grassroots. I try to do it from a power conscious way where, people who work with me get authorship on publications, and they get access to these journals that have been historically been completely inaccessible to the masses. And then the method of how I'm doing it, right? I'm going to the community and doing research with the community, not on the community, and that's been traditionally what it's been. It's been on the community, not
So,
for the community or with the community. I'm doing it with the community, kind of partnering hand in hand and doing things like this with you to kind of bring a culture of not just awareness and education, but a level of investment and buy-in that, this actually matters to us. This isn't just like a research endeavor that's on fluff my CV and
yes.
like, oh, look at this fancy resume Amelia has. No, this is like a collective effort for all of us, and my children are going to benefit from this, inshallah.
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
my dua for all of us is that, inshallah, we can recognize the value of doing this, and in turn create a social movement of change in our masajid, change in our community spaces, change in our families, most importantly, change in our families, which eventually will drive change in our communities. And so it really starts with individuals who are invested and committed. And if you are interested in supporting me, I will put my website link, and there's several ways you can support me and support this work. And, I'm not the only person doing this work, but I am one of the people who's at the forefront of dismantling that stigma, especially from a personal perspective. So that takes a lot of energy out of me. There's only so much smiles I wake up with when I wake up in the morning, because I'm literally talking about death all the time. So, and not just death of any kind, but suicide death. So, that's one thing I want people to know. And I want people to understand that suicide is an act of self-directed violence, and with the intention to cause death in your life. So you want to end your life. And I think I just really want people to understand that violence has been so normalized in our American culture. And even the things that we find funny and jokes are have subtle undertones of violence to them. So I would really love if people understood just how far kindness goes when it comes to suicide prevention. And it's not just the things I mentioned, like housing and income. Those are all really important factors that are suicide prevention. But kindness, kindness. You don't have to agree with somebody's lifestyle. You don't have to agree with the way they practice Islam. You don't have to agree with what they look like. You just gotta be nice because that's what the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam did. And to end on a final Islamic reminder, and I hope you'll share yours too, that there was a Jewish beggar who was unable to really feed himself, and the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu would come to him every day and feed him by hand and make the food in such a way that it was easy for the person to chew. And this person hated Prophet Muhammad sallallahu and would often preach, that don't follow Muhammad. Don't follow Muhammad. He's this, he's that. And because he was blind, he didn't know that it was Prophet Muhammad feeding him the entire time. And then the kindness of Prophet Muhammad was evident because when he passed away, and I believe it was Abu Bakr who was tasked with, feeding the beggar. And, Abu Bakr tries to feed him, and the guy's like, hey, this is not what I'm used to. Who are you? And, it turns out that Abu Bakr tried to convince him it's still Muhammad, and he's like, no, Muhammad had a very specific way of feeding me. He would make the little portions like this, and he's like, where? Or sorry, not Muhammad, but he didn't know it was Muhammad. And then Abu Bakr was like, oh, I'm sorry, you're right, it was Muhammad. And he said, oh my God, this is Muhammad, and then he accepted Islam.
Oh, subhanallah, it's amazing.
So,
Totally.
I mean, your kindness is dawah. Your kindness is suicide prevention. Your kindness is Islam. That is what Islam is to me, honestly. And I think that marrying that message of kindness with suicide prevention, that's what I represent. I represent that, and I represent hope as a survivor.
Allahu Akbar. That's so beautifully said. And on the color chart that you shared with me in connection with suicide, I'm a teal, which is supporting survivors of suicide attempts. So alhamdulillah, that's this subject matter is very special to me, and I'm very honored that you asked me, and it matters a lot to me, not only because of my personal connection, but because, as you said, saving the life of one is saving the life of all. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless you in your work. Yes, thank you for sharing that. Supporting someone who struggles or has attempted. So yeah, please look at this lovely chart, and hopefully this can motivate you to kind of spread the awareness and support this mission in general, and also future Dr. Amelia's work, inshallah. In the making. No, I shouldn't say future, it's in the making. Alhamdulillah. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bless you, Amelia, in your work, and put barakah in it, and bless your husband and your children and all your efforts, and make it fruitful and successful, inshallah. And we ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blesses everybody with deep love for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and has the means to live a happy life, not only in this life, but in the hereafter, a truly successful life, which is knowing Allah and preserving their life, and helping to help others preserve their life. Allahumma ameen. Jazakumullah khairan.
Jazakumullahu khairan. I will be ending